We wanted to create a fun, non-judgmental space where women can talk about their shared experiences.
Here, we will normalize the challenges we face as females living in a society that dictates unrealistic and outdated expectations on what a woman should be.
Together, we hope to cultivate a supportive community of women who empower one another to courageously live unapologetically.
A quick disclaimer before we get started. Although Cindy and Danielle are licensed therapists, this podcast is not to be interpreted as therapy or a replacement of therapeutic services. It is strictly a conversation between two women about their experiences in the world. If you liked today's episode, please make sure to like and subscribe below. Also, follow us on all of our social media platforms at Unapologetically Females. With that being said, we hope you enjoy this episode.
We are finally back after our, month-ish long hiatus.
Yep.
We have taken a little break, and we are starting off with a bang. With a special guest. To continue on with our Inspiring Women's series, we have Sophia Ruiz here. She is the founder and owner of
Haus.
Haus.
Spelled
Sanahaus. Haus. 4 letters and 4 letters, so it's like balanced.
Oh, I like that.
I like that too.
It also, it's probably very aesthetically pleasing.
It is. It does look good on a bottle.
Right.
Yeah, it does look good on a bottle. Yeah.
Nice. And also, our listeners are very familiar with the person that makes this whole thing go round.
Yes.
The infamous Georgia. And this is Georgia's sister. So we are super grateful to have you here. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Of course, thank you for having me. We have literally had the best conversations already. So you guys are getting literally like the meat of our time together, which is,
I love it.
Yeah.
We've spent quite some time talking
prior
to recording, and it's been the best conversation. So thank you.
Yeah.
So you're here today. We want to just highlight really your experience and talk through how you've gotten to where you're at, really, and how that's led you here to today. And so, can you share with us just from the beginning a little bit about growing up? Where did you grow up, and how did childhood look to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I was born. We talked about this a little bit already, but I was born in Atlanta, and so essentially we moved from. My parents are Australian. They moved to Atlanta, had me, and then we moved back to Australia, then to New Zealand, then to California, then we were in Ohio for a little bit, and now we're in Arizona. So I was kind of all over the place. I didn't really, the thing that has really grounded me has been family, because we didn't have like friends or a school or like even one particular culture that really grounded us. So we had a very like kind childhood, but in kind of the best way, because we got to see so many different cultures, so many different, kind of schools, the way they do school in different countries and all of that. And so that was like I feel like it like rounded me well as a person. You just see so many different ways of life. So you're very like open to how life can be, and you don't really have any sort of one set way of being that you think is like the way to be, Right. So I think that has really, especially in what I do, because it is kind of like unconventional, and it is kind of crazy to be a woman entrepreneur starting in their early 20s and, being a mom and, but I never, because of the way I grew up, and my dad was, he traveled, he was a PGA golf professional. And so he traveled the world, and
I didn't know that.
I used to be a PGA golf player. So he traveled the world, and he kind of had that same experience where he just had like seen everything and different cultures, and he saw went to museums and saw in Japan like the war and just like how tragic everything. So he just kind of was very awake to the nature of life and how different life can be and how lucky it is to be alive and experience things. And so he just was very kind of let us just be however we wanted to be. Both my parents, really. So I think definitely my dad being who he is, and then you know, the experience that we had growing up and living in so many different places really allowed me to be okay with being unconventional and different. And like, they never made me question it. They just were like, you're going to figure it out. And like, you know, you're just you, and, you know, and so I think that that's really the reason why at like 20, the ripe age of 21, you know, being a mom already, and all of that, I was just kind of comfortable with it. So I think that part is probably like the standout part of like my childhood that I think really shaped me into who I am. I mean, there's lots of other things like religion and church and spirituality and like the divine and all of that I experienced at a young age that I think has shaped it as well. But that's kind of like the defining experience, I think, is just,
When you were going through all of that, the moves, and they're not like just moving 15 minutes down the road moves either. We're moving countries,
big moves.
You know, huge moves. Even
sorry,
you're good. She's really busy, and people
oh my gosh,
are trying to
right
reach
when we
her.
start recording.
Yeah, she is an in-demand woman.
Yeah.
But so huge moves, like they're not small moves even. And so were there times ever that you were like, and we're picking up and now I'm moving here? Was it consciously ever challenging for you, or were you ever connected to one place more than another and it was harder to leave that place? Did you ever think of that, or was like, oh, great, we're on another adventure, like let's go with it?
I think it was the latter. Like okay. I honestly, I didn't think anything of it. And I don't know if that's because it's just kind of like how I am as a person. Like maybe I place less value on like, you know, routine and normality and like kind of like societal constructs, which I definitely think is probably a little bit like of it. But I feel like my parents just made it like we were all doing it together. And so it was like something we were all doing together. And that was all that really was like important. Like if we were separated, that was weird, you know? And there was times where my dad like had to travel for work or had to move somewhere before the rest of us moved. And that was weird. That was what was, so I think, I don't know. I mean, I should probably ask my parents if it was intentional, but I think we just had such a tight family unit, and like it was always like we're a team and we're doing this together. That it was like, oh yeah, like we're just on another adventure, you know.
That was my first thought. Was it's such a tribute to your parents?
Yeah,
right?
I haven't really like put too much thought into that, you know, historically, but I definitely think that that's like, you know, probably something that they intentionally did. And my mom, when she was growing up, my granddad, her dad, was a traveling pastor. And so she was kind of accustomed to the traveling life. And, you know, so I don't think it was foreign to her. And maybe because it wasn't foreign to her, that like it just was all kind of just
felt natural
to and because of that, to all of us. Yeah, and so I never ever felt attached to one place. Yeah, and I never felt attached to friends at school. I never felt attached to, you know, homes or locations. I just didn't really have a preference. It was always just like, we were just comfortable where we were, you know, because we were just all together. And
what a cool life lesson,
Right?
Right? I mean, you learned so much from that you could never teach in a classroom, or you could never learn, you know, at a university.
Right.
Like everything that you saw and the experiences that you had and the different cultures and like, wow.
And it's crazy because it's like when you're going through it, you're not even thinking like, oh yeah, this is a good life lesson. Like let me adapt this. It just like writes itself into your experience and your story. And then you wake up one day and you realize not everybody thinks this way. Like not everybody had this experience, and that people actually have to go through so much or have to go through so many classes, like you said, in a university or whatever, to actually understand those concepts and
but not live them.
And not live them.
So different.
It's very
different.
Yeah, it doesn't. All of my biggest lessons in life have never been through knowledge. It's always been through experience. Like
absolutely.
the thing that assimilates, like the lessons that I can just like pull and just be like, no, this is a
Who
value.
you are.
Yeah. Like this is a value of mine. This is a guiding value. This is, you know, an important like thing to me, have always been because of the experience and never because of somebody wrote it in a book.
Right.
It's got to be the best way to learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know.
It feels like it is, you know?
Yeah.
What is the longest you've been in a place?
So we lived in California for the longest stretch of time, and we were in even when we were in like one specific city, you know, for a specific amount of time, even if it was an extended period of time, it was often like multiple like houses or multiple schools. But in California, we actually lived in one house for 7 years, and I went to I was in the same school district for 7 years. And I actually graduated high school when I was 16, actually. So I tested out early. So
Of course you did.
I know. I'm like, we need to.
so unconventional.
We need to unpack that.
Yeah.
So, because traditionally, an individual that is, you know, moving schools, and well, I guess you had seven years in that school, and those are pretty formative years too.
Yes.
So
So the most formative years in one place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell us about school. How was that experience for you?
Yeah, I kind of floated through school weirdly. I think like I always when we moved from New Zealand to California, it was a very different school system. And I think America in general is a very different school system, but especially California, like being a very like, you know, it's...
I've noticed that too, growing up in Southern California.
Yeah. They have like very high standards. And so I don't really know too much about the New Zealand school system. And I don't really remember much when I was in school there, but it was very different. And so there was an adjustment period when I was moving to an American school, a Californian school, where it was kind of a difficult adjustment for me, but after I got through that and I kind of got up to par with their standards, I just kind of floated through school. I never ever had to study for a test ever in my life.
Wow.
I think I've maybe studied for one test in my life. I just went through school and did generally, like I got A's and B's throughout my whole school career, except for one C, I think, in PE when I was like 15, and I had like started birth control, and I like gained 15 pounds, and I was like, and then I like all of a sudden didn't like want to do. I was always like super athletic, and then after birth control that went out the window. But
That's funny.
yeah. But yeah, I just kind of floated through school. I mean, there was a geometry class that I was in, you know, 9th grade. And I watched Netflix the entire time, like on my phone in the class. But I aced that class, like, you know.
Okay,
You're
don't
one,
tell
I
your
know, I was
kids
like,
that.
you're one of those.
Do not tell your kids that.
Do not recommend. Yeah.
No, just that it was so easy for you.
Yeah.
I kind of just floated through. And when I was 15, 16, my sophomore year, I got involved kind of with the church and, you know, that whole experience. And I started to kind of see, like, you know, stuff beyond just like regular schooling. And I never really had an attachment to regular schooling. And I never even really was like, oh, I know what college I'm going to go to, or I know what I'm going to do with my life. I was just kind of like floating through life, where it was just like, you know, just doing whatever.
Sure.
And was just kind of like, oh yeah, like I'll work it out, and you know. And now I'm growing up now, because that was like my parents were always just like really okay with that. Like you just find you and do you.
That's kind of how your life went, right?
Yeah.
Like it was not as structured as our education system makes us.
Yeah, and I didn't even really know that was like a thing until I got kind of got to the age where I am now in the last few years, and I've been like, it's really weird that I didn't like know what college I was going to go to, or like
it wasn't even a thought.
It wasn't even a thought. Like I wasn't even considering it. And so, you know, I when I tested out early, it was just because I was just like, oh, like I'm interested in this thing, and I was like involved in the church, and you know, kind of just like, you know, I was in that community, and I was like, we were doing like outreach to homeless people. And
so what was that thought? Was it like, I'm gonna I'm going to graduate early because I want to serve. And
it was more of just like nothing in my, up until probably a few years ago, nothing has ever been like fully deliberate.
Yeah.
It's always been, I'm kind of feeling good here and I want to be here more. So I think I'm just going to be here more.
What a cool way to live.
But also kind of like I look back on myself and I'm like, gosh, like thank God I made it. Like thank God I actually like didn't come out of that like doing like crazy stuff, because I just like didn't have a thought. Like I would just do things. But like big things, like I tested out early for school just because I felt like, oh yeah, like I'm kind of like enjoying the church vibe right now, and I kind of want more freedom to like be able to like make my own schedule and do my own thing. And so I just tested out of high school early.
And your parents were like, sure, go ahead.
Super. And I probably because it was like, oh yeah, church, like because they had like, it was a good environment. It wasn't like I was like going to be off in some like blood cult somewhere, like, oh, I want the freedom to go do that. You know, it was like the Christian church. So it was like, like this is a great place for her to be. And because my parents were kind of radicals back in the day, like they were like Jesus freaks, and they started churches, and you know they moved across the world to plant a church in a city that they've never been to, and they knew 2 people that were going with them. So that kind of like radical
just
sort of
following
dedication,
in our footsteps.
it was like, oh yeah, like this is normal, you know, and it's like really not, but it was like to them it was just normal. So it was like, you know, and maybe in the back of their mind too, they thought, I've never really asked them what they thought about it. They honestly probably were just like, yeah, cool, whatever, like go do your thing. Yeah. But I think it's like, well, what harm is it in testing out of high school? You're not going to be around all those bad influences and, you know, like that kind of thing.
Right.
So yeah, it wasn't. I'm almost afraid, like I'm like scared for myself back then, looking back, like how like unintentional
16?
I was. Yes.
16 is
young.
You're young. Like it's still.
But I always have had this, like I feel like I've had an adult in my brain, like where I've just like been like kind of mature for my age, where I just thought I was way older than I was. Like I never questioned that I'm just 16 and I can't make decisions for myself. I was like, yeah, like I so know what's good for me, you know? Like I'm like, yeah, like I've got this all down, guys. Like don't even worry about me for a second. Like, you know, like I know what I want and I'm gonna go get it. And, you know, thankfully I
carried you far in life. Like that determination.
Yeah,
you know?
And thankfully, like it wasn't directed in a negative way, you know, where like that kind of energy and that kind of perspective on life could have easily gone downhill, like very horribly. And there have been moments where my impulsivity and my determination and my sort of brashness about life has like not been good. But that's been more like recently when I've had a little bit more power to play with in my own life, and you know, more freedom and decisions, and you just get exposed to more things. You have, you know, you're kind of exploring avenues that you've never explored before, and you just kind of jump into it without thinking, and then you're like, oh, I probably should have thought about that before I did it. But yeah, it's kind of crazy that I was so just like whatever, like I was just doing and just doing it because, and I didn't even have a second thought. Like
no self-doubt.
No.
None.
Yeah. Not even for a moment, which is just wild thinking back, you know.
How would, like, what top 3 words would you use to describe yourself as a child?
I was very, I feel like I went through 2 different phases in my life where when I was younger, I was very shy.
That's fascinating to me.
Yes, I felt like it was weird. It was like, but when I hit like 11 or 12, it was like I shifted into this other person. Where before I was like, and I remember making like a conscious decision of like, I'm not going to be shy anymore. I'm not going to be, you know, worried about like, I just was like, I'm just going to be this person now. And it was like, I went from being this shy, very kind of like, you know, quiet, like socially awkward, like person that loved animals and loved, you know, like just like caring for little things and this little, like this little like sweet little thing. And then I just went into this full like determined, like, ball buster, like
fiery
person that it just emerged out of me, like it had always been there. But I like almost like made the conscious decision to like acknowledge that was coming.
Was there someone or something that
I don't
made that like
made
you realize that about yourself?
It's literally quite literally like it just emerged out of me and I acknowledged it. I don't remember there being an initiating event. I don't remember. I think it was maybe just like, you know what it could have been is that we lived, the area that we lived in around that time, I started to see people, I think I have always had an inherent sort of understanding of power dynamics in relationships and in societies where you notice the most powerful people and you notice what gives people power and what doesn't. And I've always been very like conscious and aware from a young age of like not wanting to give myself away or give people too much information about myself because I would be afraid that they would use it against me or they would
equip them with arm them with
information.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I had like a weird sort of uncanny understanding of that, like natural understanding of that at a young age.
You're
and
very
so when
observant.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say. Like definitely an old soul.
Yeah,
like you've always been grown.
Yeah,
like mentally.
And that's how I felt. I feel like I've had an adult voice in my head since I can remember. You know, it's weird.
Yeah.
I think that was maybe the undertone of it, that when we moved into this one specific area in California, that I started to see that the power dynamics were no longer, like in Australia and New Zealand, the culture is very like, we're all equals and we're all mates. They call it the tall poppy culture, tall poppy syndrome, where you cut people who jump out and try to be better than you and try to have sort of like a...
Say that again.
Tall poppy syndrome. Like basically the poppy that grows the tallest, then they chop it down.
Okay.
So it's like everybody's equals, and that's like a part of like the undertone of the culture, the Australian culture, is that we're all just humans and we're all just equals, and we don't try to make it seem like we're better than anyone else, or that there's, if you work a certain job, that it makes you better, or if you're...
I love that.
Yeah. So super very cool. Opposite to California.
Yeah.
So very then true. moving to California, I want to say that potentially that sort of inherent understanding of power dynamics that I was sort of picking up on as a very young child, that when I saw people dressed a certain way and they had money and they had, like... prominence is like a currency of power dynamics in California, in America, but especially in California. And so I think I started to just become aware of the way that people were that had power, even like. It's so funny because it's like as kids, it's like what 8-year-old has power or what 9-year-old has power, but even amongst peers, I started to notice
group dynamics
and who was at the top of the food chain and why and and all of those things. And I think I just sort of started to go, you know what, like I'm going to be at the top of the food chain, and like as like this this sweet little caring soft kid who then was like, oh, I see the power dynamics here, now I'm going to decide to be. Whereas in Australia it was like just who you are, and we're all equals. So there was no sort of tug of power dynamics and people above you and whatever. Then in California, it was that. So I think I was maybe that being in that environment like activated that part of me that was there.
Yeah. You got motivated by that. Yeah.
And I think that's what caused the shift. And so in to answer your question, like in the early days of my childhood, I think I would describe myself as being very soft, very compassionate, quiet, and just like, I loved music and, like dance and, just like this, I was just like a little kid,
Do you still have that side to you somewhere?
For sure.
Yeah.
And the compassionate side is like almost debilitating at this point, and I think, when you get especially now being older, being more exposed to the world, it's kind of funny because I'm almost like reverting. I'm almost like making a full circle back to who that kid was. Mm-hmm. But definitely in the early phases of my life, I would describe myself as that. But then once I, you know, kind of made that transition, or, you know, whatever it was that happened, I was fiery, I was determined, and I would say I was maybe even like, you know, I was like, I would say maybe highly perceptive is probably something that describes me as a whole from the moment I was born.
Sure. I could see that.
But I think that, you know, fiery, determined, and just like, like just going for it. Mm-hmm.
How did that play out in teenage years?
My teenagers were, for me as a person, I was like really enjoying them individually, like on a personal level, because
Georgia says yes.
Because when you match that, like the high perceptiveness and the determination together, I felt like I was like running my life. I was doing great. I was like, I had lots of friends. I felt like I understood people, and I felt like I knew what I wanted, and as long as I knew what I wanted, I could go and I could have it. And so I felt like I was on the top of the world, you know, like I was like in high school, and, you know, had lots of friends and all of that. And you know, that was a rough period of time for my parents, but especially my mom, because I was just mean. Because to me, it's like when you're very, very determined and you're very, very driven, you can borderline sometimes, especially when you're younger, you can borderline on like being manipulative and being like, people are an accessory to your purpose.
Right.
And I
almost have blinders on. Like, just put your head down and do
so
it.
Because my parents had always been there, and it was like, oh yeah, like it was like they, you know, not that they became an accessory, but I think I just, like, everybody in the world was kind of an accessory to me. And not that I was consciously doing that, but it was like I definitely, you know, didn't really care for how my actions affected people as much as I probably should have, which is odd because I am such a compassionate, caring person. And it was like that part of me just kind of like faded away, where I didn't care, you know, how I made people feel. I was just doing my thing.
I think some of that and how you're describing would be attributed to age.
Yeah,
like
it's age appropriate.
I absolutely think so. It's like you have this, you know, 100% like maturity, and your perception and perspective of the world and what you want, and your ambition is very mature, very adult, but your brain is still 16, 15, you know what I mean? And so
every teenager's a little bit of a narcissist.
Sure.
And that was definitely my experience. And I think it was like weird because I was like almost conscious that like it was like
you knew it. You knew what you were doing.
Yeah, like it was like I knew like, oh yeah, like this is my brain. Like it was like I was acknowledging that was like a physical, I was like the observer, you know, like I was observing my physical body do things, and I've noticed, I've been kind of like aware of that too. And when I turned 25 and my frontal cortex finished, like it's finally rounded out, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm myself now. Like I don't have all of these weird hormones or this, you know, incomplete brain structure that is like, feels like it's like counter intuitive or like antithetical to like who I am as a human being anymore. And I finally felt like, okay, like I'm no longer fighting my brain, like my personality is no longer fighting my brain, and now I'm just like, I feel fully integrated into like my body.
It's such a complicated dynamic to be aware of the two, like of the things in your brain that are in opposition, and you're like, but I know who I am, but I'm not necessarily behaving in that manner. And so it like,
but you also had the experience of two opposing cultures.
Yes.
And so that had to kind of play a role in the confusion as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think even to this day, it does play a little bit of a role because you know, my family and I were all of us are so tight knit. And so even though there was this culture that I was exposed to in school and a little bit in like the church world, but especially in school because it's, you know, very like just regular
Regimented.
society. Whereas the church has its own kind of culture that's like weirdly, it's like a subculture within a culture,
Right.
you know, whereas school is just like the culture of, you know, our country is like basically in school. Like, you know, it's like the same, like one and the same.
It's what you do.
Yeah. So, you know, but at home, it was like very Australian. My parents are like, you know, even though my parents are very cultured in the sense of like, they're not like, they're not married to their culture. Like if there's something that's
they're malleable.
Yes, they're malleable. Like there was something that they didn't like about the culture, they wouldn't adopt it. But Aussie culture is kind of really cool. Like it is very chill. It's like very, you know, and I feel like it's very congruent with my personality. And I think my parents and all of my siblings would say the same. But yeah, it was weird because at home it was a very Australian dynamic where it's like, we're not going to, you know, it's silly to go and like pursue something just for like money or like a cool to say, to walk into a room and say, yeah, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. Like they just in Australia, you just don't do that. Like it's like very much like just, I don't know, be who you are. Like who do you want to be? And there's no
status
associated
it's very, with those things.
Yes, it's not nowhere near as status focused as America is.
Everyone's on the same playing field.
Yes, like yes, very much so, very much so. And so, yeah, it was very odd because I'm contending with like, you know, differences in my brain, and I'm like maybe a little bit neurodivergent, like maybe a little bit ADHD, maybe a little bit like, you know, who knows. So like those things, and then like having no real like roots in a culture, having no real roots in like friend groups or, you know, societal structures or anything like that. It was just like my family and like the experiences that I had in life. And so to come into those formative years where you're dealing with brain development and all of the changes that accompany that while having like no real like fundamental things to ground you and to like give you a sense of identity, and, you know, then differences in culture and having a culture at home and a culture in school and a culture in the church. And it's just like lots of things going on. And weirdly, like, I feel like my brain handled all of it pretty well.
Yeah, because it could be really confusing.
Yes.
I mean, when you talk about everybody on the same playing field and then you go into even the church world, right? And there's a hierarchy system in there.
Especially in America. In Australia, the church is not like that at all. It's very much the same. It's contextualized by the Australian culture of like even playing field.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very like egalitarian, very like.
Was that upsetting to you to like experience that in Australia and then come here and see the difference? Was that confusing or upsetting?
I think, you know, what's really interesting about that experience is I think anyone would, like most people would feel that. But I think I was really young when I experienced the church that way. So I was kind of like, you know, I didn't really like have a very intensely conscious experience of it. But also when we went to church was a big part of our lives, and when the church that we went to, my mom was a pastor there. So she was kind of molding the environment that we were in towards that more even playing field, egalitarian. Like
this was once you were in the United States.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. When we moved to California, the reason we moved was because my mom got a job at a church, and so even though like it would have been more shocking, I think, except for the fact that my mom was actually molding the culture a little bit.
Super
yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So she was actually, her values of egalitarian, even playing field, don't be weird, don't try to exploit, you know, a religious, you know, structure for your own status. Like, don't try to exploit people to get ahead in your career or like make this like some sort of ladder to climb. Like, you come here, if you love God, then just do what he puts in your heart to do. Like, it's that simple. Like, you know.
You're all even poppies.
Yes, exactly. It's an even playing field. Like, we're all equals here. And so I think if it hadn't have been that way, it probably would have been a real culture shock. But she was molding the culture in that way. And it wasn't until we moved to a different church that was a little bit more rigid that we all kind of felt it was like, that was when it was a real culture shock.
Okay.
And I think that's when I started to have like, oh, wow, like the church isn't this way. And I don't really like that, you know?
How old were you at that point?
I was actually a lot older, so I was in my 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just, I'm thinking of the 11, 12-year-old who decided to come out of her shell and how that played in that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think church really didn't play a role in that, funnily enough. When that happened, I was actually like kind of, I had been in that socially awkward kind of like shy phase where I didn't want to go to church because I didn't want to go to kids' church because I think subconsciously I realized I didn't really relate to the kids that were there. And so I was just like, I just felt really awkward because I just felt like maybe I wasn't going to be subconsciously like felt like I didn't relate to anybody there. So I wasn't really in church at that moment. And what really was really like the catalyst, I think, for that moment was more school. So, so church was kind of like a took a back seat at that moment. And it wasn't until I was 15, 16, that when I got into the church and started to get more involved with the church, and, you know, was kind of like being more present there and connecting to community there, and felt like I could actually relate to peers for the first time, that I, you know, that's when that kind of shift, that's when my energy got more directed towards the church and maybe even the power structures within the church, whereas previously from like 11, 12, when that shift happened, the primary vehicle for me, like pushing my energy towards things and determination was more the social structures at school. And then 15, 16 I diverted my energy to the church.
So I know your family system is super tight and close, but given that like emotional and just overall intelligence, was it ever lonely being you?
I think I was definitely, I don't know if I was lonely, but I was definitely a loner where I like was happy to be by myself, like at home. Like I always had like one close friend that I really loved, you know, to hang out with. And that was often, you know, it was often just, like one friend amongst maybe, it was never really a friend group. But I kind of just, I enjoyed just like being by myself. I don't think I was ever really lonely. I think because we were so tight-knit, it's almost like you just like, that's just like the launching pad that you like. So I wasn't looking for companionship. Companionship always kind of just found me. And with the people that I found it with, it was kind of, you know, it was just like comfortable and cool. And I didn't really have any problems with relationships. I don't think I really have. That's never been like a pain point for me in life.
Yeah.
But I was kind of alone. And even when I was with friends at that point in time, it felt like we were always just kind of like, I was like,
independent.
Yeah, independent, and like I was almost like putting on a character of like somebody that they could relate to, like just talking about stuff that just kind of seemed whatever.
Also age appropriate.
Yeah. And so yeah, it was like, and then when I kind of had that moment where I kind of became, you know, this different person, when I just like came out of my shell, that was when I had a lot of friends, and I think that was probably just because we were just. I started to understand the value of community, but it was also a little bit of a power structure thing, like the people with the most friends, like,
right.
But there was
popularity,
all of it,
yeah.
And that was a big theme in my life as a kid, and I think in the early 2000s it was maybe a theme that if you were a kid in the early 2000s, like the Mean Girls narrative and like all of those, you know, that was like the thing, and it wasn't like my relationships were superficial in that like. I was using relationships as a vehicle for like popularity or like anything like that. But relationships just started to come very naturally to me. And I really genuinely appreciated and loved the people that I was friends with. And I think that was part of the reason why I just was feeling like, you know, how we were talking about, like just feeling really like like life's great. And, you know, I'm this like raging teenager who's like, you know, kind of angry and, you know, energetic. And my parents were like, what's
happening?
Like, what happened to this kid? You're like a different person, you know?
But that confidence is probably partly what attracted all those people to you.
I think so.
Absolutely.
And it was like it was weird because it was like foreign to me, but at the same time it wasn't. Like I'd always been this kind of like shy, awkward, kind of quiet, like sweet kid. And then all of a sudden this like, you know, this person who was like fun and like, you know, like kind of like didn't have a care in the world and was just like going for it, just came out. And I was like, oh, this is really different, but at the same time it's not, you know?
Would you describe yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
I think I'm like dead smack in the middle. And I think I've oscillated into more of one or the other throughout different periods of my life. Like when I was younger, I was definitely an introvert.
How do you recharge? Do you recharge alone or do you recharge by being around people?
Weird, like to say, but I think equally, I feed off of energy in rooms where I feel like I connect with people. Yeah. Like if I feel like people understand me and I understand them, and I can get a feel like I feel like I can get to know you, and there's like we cut through like the weird small talk and we're just like talking about life. I like that for me. I get so energized by that. Yeah. But I also like
I understand that.
Yeah.
Small talk kills my soul.
Oh my God. I'm like, okay, what's like your biggest trauma in life? Let's talk about it. I've known you for like 5 seconds. And I love when people are not afraid to talk about that. I'm like, oh my God, thank God. Yeah. You know, like, because I'm like, you want to talk about the weather or like where you went out over the weekend? Like, I'm like, I want to get to know you as a person, you know?
Absolutely.
But I also love I'm a total homebody. Like I could be totally happy out doing stuff, talking, as long as there's no small talk and it's not weird. Like as long as we're like,
as long as we can talk about trauma.
Yeah. As long as we're connecting on a soul level, I'll happily be out. But I also could happily be home. You know, I love, and I love my husband. I love my daughter. Like I love family, and so I love being around family at home. And I could be at home all the time with my family. But if I was just alone, I think maybe I wouldn't love to be alone, but I could also totally entertain myself. Like I would find things to do and recharge. Like I would, do a, skincare and have a spa day at home, and, so and like, I feel like I'm weirdly in the middle. Like I don't really have a preference. Like I just want, I want to be wherever I'm supposed to be. And that's
well said. I like that.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Unapologetically Females. Stay tuned for next week's episode, which is part 2 of our Inspiring Women's episode with Sophia Ruiz.